I recently played Avowed, and that game, at least for me, was a total disappointment. Obsidian really dropped the ball on that one. But then I remembered I played another Obsidian title, Outer Worlds 2, and that one also wasn't something I would recommend. Two Obsidian games, both of them questionable, and that's me being generous, by the way. Time to dive into this deeper in order to figure out just what the hell is going on with Obsidian Entertainment. For this analysis, there is one article that can help us in this quest. This one, a piece from Jason Schreier, link down below. I'll give you two views on this particular matter. What the article is saying and what I think based on the time I spent playing these games, as well as my experience with previous Obsidian titles. Then we'll make a summary and see where that leads us on this particular issue. Let's start with the article. The main premise here is that two big RPGs, Outer Worlds 2 and Avowed, missed Microsoft's sales target. Both were in development 6 to 7 years, both had inflated production costs, both failed to meet Microsoft's internal sales expectations. Basically, they were too expensive for the level of impact they had. If I were to interpret this, I'd say it's a mismatch between the scope and payoff. And you know what's funny? Obsidian CEO himself openly admits 5 to 7 year dev cycles are bad. I mean, developing a game for that long is never a good idea. Even I, a common pleb, know that. And I tell you why. Long dev cycles mean more salaries to pay, more tech overhauls, more internal reworks, and higher expectations from corporate. If we compare that to Fallout New Vegas, for example, it took under 2 years to make the game. The game cost around $8 million. It reused Fallout 3 tech, and at the end became legendary. However, not everything was rainbows and sunshine. We must not forget New Vegas was crunched like there's no tomorrow, not to mention the game came out broken as fuck. Still, it seems to me that old Obsidian was more efficient, scrappy, and focused, while new Obsidian has long cycles, reboots, and directional shifts. Why am I saying this? Well, when it comes to Avowed alone, it was supposed to be originally a multiplayer, and then they pivoted, and then they changed directors. And in order to make the game, it took 7 years. In other words, they didn't really know what they wanted, and then they started meandering. Kinda reminds me of the development cycle of Mass Effect Andromeda a bit. And we all know what kind of shitshow that was. The article mentions another thing, which is Microsoft's 30% profit margin, and that created a lot of pressure. Because Xbox is now targeting 30%, and that changes everything. When your margins are that high, that means that risk is basically shrinking and scope is scrutinized. What that means in the end is that budgets must justify themselves. And I think this could explain why Avowed feels smaller than expected, why Outer Worlds 2 feel cautious, and why all of the systems in those two games simply feel simplified. If you wanted to summarize this situation in one term, it would be cost control. Another point that was raised in the article is all about studio size versus ambition mismatch. Obsidian has around 280 employees, and if you compare that with Larian Studios, which is around 500 plus employees, and CDPR, which has 1.3k employees, you can kinda see what the issue here is. Obsidian is basically trying to make a AAA scale RPG with AA manpower. And knowing that, they still are releasing 3 games in 1 year. That's complete madness if you ask me. Juggling 3 projects, knowing how many people you have is insane. I mean, what's the point of churning out 3 projects and 2 of them fail? You pretty much have 33% success rate. And that's bad, man. They themselves admit that it's the result of things going wrong. Support teams were overstretched, burnout risk increased, and internal resources were thin. While we are not directly talking about Grounded 2, it gave them key lessons. Mainly because it was partly outsourced, so hard calls were made fast, features were cut quickly, and scope was controlled. Meanwhile, for the things that they were doing internally, they say that it felt like they were running around with kid gloves. What that means is that they had too much iterations, not enough decisive leadership, and features linger too long, which eventually leads to bloated timelines. Also, you know how people were criticizing certain aspects of the games, and then the fanboys were like, "You're just hating it"? Well, here they themselves admit that maybe Avowed needed crime system. Maybe it needed more world interactivity. Maybe Outer Worlds needed stronger companions. And that's all good and fine, but everybody can be a general after the battle, so to speak. If you haven't noticed these issues while you were developing the game, or even better, when you were in pre-production, then this is a huge problem. And personally to me, this is something that I definitely wouldn't attribute to Obsidian, knowing how much experience they have developing games. Finally, another key point that was raised was their 100-year plan philosophy. This means that they want moderate success instead of going with risky mega hits. They want to avoid massive headcount growth, keep juggling multiple projects, and reuse tech instead of reinventing it. I would say on paper that sounds stable until you realize what modern RPG audience expects. Massive reactivity, system depth, and big production values. So in that sense, moderate might not cut it anymore. One might argue that the industry changed faster than Obsidian could adapt. So what's the summary of this particular article? Well, it seems to me that Obsidian wants to do a lot of things, but because they lack the resources, they are spreading themselves thin, and then everything pretty much suffers because of it. They also seem to be living in some kind of a bubble because they aren't noticing fundamental issues with their games. Next, they are being harassed by Microsoft and their profitability targets, and while that might sound nasty, for better or for worse, Microsoft owns them, so they can set up the rules however they want. But the biggest issue here that I can see is that they don't really know what they want to make. The scopes aren't defined, and they keep going back to drawing board. And that's why the dev cycle is so long. Pretty much, one would say they are struggling structurally. Okay, so this is what the article says. Now, let's look at this from a gamer perspective, which is my perspective given the fact I played both of the games. I'll try to be brief about what issues both of the games had, but for those of you who want to go more in depth, you can always check both of my reviews. I'll put the link in the description or something along the lines. Let's start with Avowed since it was the first one to be released. Avowed suffers from what I would call the Dragon Age virus, meaning the art style 100% does not correspond to the previous games in the series. Just remember the official announcement trailer and compare it to the current situation. The dissonance is more than obvious. It punches you directly in the gut. It's the equivalent of wrapping shit into a nice paper and selling it, and since the package looks amazing, you buy it, but when you open it, the surprise is extremely dissatisfying. The story of that game was uneven and underwhelming. Combat was repetitive, annoying, tactically weak, and extremely frustrating. Crafting, or rather upgrading system, makes the combat and the general experience feel even worse, considering you are constantly feeling underpowered. Companions have limited control, lack of customization, bad writing, and they feel more like support props in combat rather than fully fleshed reactive partners. Game feels like a static theater rather than a living fantasy realm. And finally, the price sucks. I mean, for real, $80 on launch for this, and even now the price of $50-$60 still feels too much given what we are getting for that type of money. Then there's Outer Worlds 2. First issue is bad replayability loop with skills. You essentially gated the content of your own game by having a badly conceptualized skill system. Maybe I would have replayed the game to see different outcomes, but with this particular system, I would say no thank you. Combat was mediocre, with mixed feelings. It's basically a shooter but has no cover system. I mean, weird flex, but okay. Companion customization is bad. Companions themselves are mid, nothing extra really. And the story is mediocre, somewhat predictable. If you compare second game to the first game in certain situations, first game is better while the sequel falls flat. This should never be the case. If anything, you should build upon the foundation, not destroy what already works. And again, just like with the Avowed, the price is abysmal. So based on what I have said, what do these two games have in common? For starters, both titles struggle to meet player expectations for depth and reactivity, with game systems being slimmer than expected for a big RPGs. Value perception was lower due to price, with players questioning if the games justified a premium cost. Spoiler alert, they didn't. Price tags for both games at launch were ridiculous. Execution didn't always match the marketing promise, leading to disappointment even among people who liked parts of the games. Avowed was expected to be Skyrim with Aora's suit, while Outer Worlds 2 didn't evolve significantly enough compared to the first game. In fact, like I already mentioned, it devolved in certain aspects, which makes it even worse. Mediocre stories seem to be a theme song for both games, which is not something Obsidian is known for. In fact, you would expect otherwise, and I would argue not in a million years would you expect from Obsidian to come with something like this. Crafting systems are too simplistic. There is no complexity, and when you think about it, it's not even crafting, it's just modifying things. Looking at companions, in both cases they are below average to average. When you compare them to companions in Knights of the Old Republic 2, New Vegas, or even companions in Pillars games, they feel like they are inferior in almost every sense. I could go on and on about these issues, but just looking at what I already mentioned, I think it's fair to say that the picture is very clear when it comes what issues both of these games share. And now that we have both of these perspectives, which means the article and what I just said, what kind of conclusions can we draw from this? I'm gonna be as blunt as I can be. I don't really care, I'm just gonna speak my mind. So, Outer Worlds 2 and Avowed weren't made by Obsidian. There has to be some kind of mistake here. Because when I look at the logo a bit more thoroughly, it looks like it's Obsidian Entertainment that made the games, not the OG company. But jokes aside, if you remove the tag saying made by Obsidian Entertainment and then release these games in that fashion, keeping the price tag like they did, I believe the criticism would be even worse. Only because of the brand, these games got some attention and leeway, so to speak. Otherwise, they would be dead on arrival. Kinda reminds me a bit of Starfield, to be honest. People are giving it a pass only because it's a Bethesda game, but in reality, it's a below-average experience. Which leads me to my next point, and this one is kinda worrisome. They don't know their target audience. For Avowed, it seems that the target audience were people who liked Skyrim, Obsidian loyalists, and finally, Game Pass casual audience. These three audiences don't perfectly overlap. Skyrim audiences expected crime systems, NPC routines, stealing, jail, emergent chaos, and huge open sandbox. Obsidian hardcore RPG audience expected dense dialogue trees, meaningful branching, complex character builds, and faction reactivity. And then you have Game Pass audience, and their expectations are pretty simple. They want immediate fun, accessible combat, and low friction systems. So the question now is, did Avowed fully satisfy any of these groups? I don't think so, to be honest. In practice, Avowed feels like it was made for people who enjoy narrative-driven fantasy ARPGs, but they don't want overwhelming systems. I would compare these people to mindless zombies that just smash buttons so big explosion happens, and everybody is satisfied. No thinking required, just acting on instinct, so to speak. And that player population is a much narrower slice of the market. Another issue here is that marketing positioned it closer to Skyrim, and being set in the Pillars universe raised expectations for CRPG level depth. So what you have here is Avowed wasn't made for the wrong audience. It was marketed to too many audiences at once. Same things can be applied for Outer Worlds 2. Target audience were fans of the first game, which is nostalgia, but also you have certain expectations. Then you have RPG players who were accessible at that moment, which means Game Pass subscribers, and ultimately, players who follow AAA RPG trends. And what was the outcome here? Well, many players felt the game didn't deepen its systems enough relative to the first one. Systems feel smaller than the promise. The first game's satire was a big draw. Fans hoped the sequel would be bolder. But the sequel's tone felt muted, polished, but not dangerous, lacking sharper political or philosophical edge, so to speak. And while it was fun, it didn't feel like a true escalation of the original. The game was also positioned as a bigger, bolder adventure, deeper, more sophisticated. But many players basically say it's just more of the same, without enough new depth. This is what you call a missed expectations. Ultimately, the original Outer Worlds succeeded because it struck a precise sweet spot. The sequel failed because it tried to accommodate everyone at once and ended up pleasing no one completely. And there's your problem, to be quite honest with you. If you try to please everyone, you will end up pleasing no one. And more importantly, you will alienate people who might have liked it. Pretty much, you lost your identity, and if that happens, it's very hard to get back on track. Now, some people might say, this all started when they got acquired by Microsoft, herder. And to that I say, chill, it's not that simple. If you look at Obsidian's trajectory over the last decade, the idea that the decline started only after Microsoft acquisition is probably too simplistic. The shift arguably began earlier. I would say it happened after Pillars of Eternity 2 Deathfire underperformed commercially despite strong critical reception. That moment seemed to signal to Obsidian that classic, system-heavy CRPGs weren't financially sustainable at AAA scale. From there, you can see a gradual pivot towards broader, more accessible design philosophies. When Microsoft acquired Obsidian in 2018, the studio gained financial security and Game Pass exposure, but it also became part of a larger ecosystem strategy. One focused on subscription value, steady content output, and wider audience appeal. The Outer Worlds already reflected that transition. Streamlined RPG systems, lighter mechanics, strong writing, but shallow depth compared to something like New Vegas. With Avowed and the Outer Worlds 2, this became more visible. These games seem caught between Obsidian's legacy as a deep RPG developer and Microsoft's need for scalable, mass-market Game Pass titles. The result is that these games feel diluted, less mechanically ambitious, safer in scope, and sometimes lacking the systemic depth that defined the studio's earlier reputation. So if there is a decline, it likely started before the acquisition in terms of design direction, but the Microsoft era amplified and solidified that trajectory rather than causing it outright. I reckon they were always the ones who were struggling, and now when Microsoft came with all their money, they got comfy, lazy, and they lost the edge that they had. Combine that with lack of direction, bad target audience, and bad resource management, and this is pretty much the outcome. Can Obsidian bounce from this? I believe they can, but the real question is whether they choose to. This isn't a studio that suddenly forgot how to make RPGs. Or at least I hope that's not the case. I reckon the talent is still there. This is the same developer behind Fallout New Vegas, Pillars of Eternity, Tyranny, and even that smaller but creatively bold Pentiment. The writing pedigree, the understanding of players' agency, the systemic RPG DNA. I don't think that foundation has disappeared. The issue feels less like incompetence and more like direction. Obsidian currently seems caught between two identities. The deep, systems-driven RPG studio they built their reputation on, and the broader, more accessible Game Pass era developer operating within Microsoft's ecosystem strategy. That tension creates games that feel polished, but restrained, because they are streamlined, safer, and less mechanically ambitious than what longtime fans expect. It's not a complete disaster, but they lack the boldness that once defined the studio. A comeback would require commitment. If Obsidian wants to reclaim its legacy audience, it would need to lean fully back into complex systems, meaningful builds, faction politics with real consequences, and unapologetic depth, not something like Skyrim-like or Mass Effect-like, but something distinct and mechanically rich. On the other hand, if they want to pursue mainstream AAA accessibility, they would need stronger cinematic identity, clearer gameplay hooks, and a more confident presentation. Right now, their current projects feel like mid-sized RPGs trying to satisfy every possible audience and fully committing to neither. Ironically, being owned by Microsoft could be their biggest advantage. Financial stability, Game Pass exposure, and reduced publisher pressure should theoretically allow for creative risk rather than encourage safety. So in my opinion, the determining factor will likely be leadership vision. Studios rarely decline because developers lose skill. They decline when direction becomes unfocused. If Obsidian rediscovers what made them distinct, they can absolutely stage a redemption. If they continue pursuing broadly appealing but diluted RPG experiences, they risk settling into comfortable mediocrity instead of reclaiming their former edge. So I reckon their destiny is in their hands, and I'm gonna be looking at them with great interest to see what path are they going to take. It's definitely going to be interesting. That's for damn sure. Right, it seems I already talked way too much, so I'm gonna end it here. Thanks for watching, and if you liked what you heard, like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. That's it from me, until the next one.